Morning, folks. Today we're going to be looking at one of the letters of Paul to the church in Corinth. Corinth was a Greek city in old Greece that Paul decided needed some correcting. So he went ahead and wrote them a long letter. In this letter, Paul talks about a lot. 1 Corinthians is packed with a lot of philosophical mumbo-jumbo, kind of espousing on the details about Christ and God and what all that means. One part in particular really stuck out to me. It comes in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. And I'm going to go ahead and start in verse 20. But this runs through a good handful of verses. Actually, I'll start in verse 18, excuse me. Paul says, "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, quote, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." Paul continues, "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." And this is verse 25 is kind of key here. "For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." I'm going to get to that in a second. It's pretty juicy. "Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God." Okay, so I take this to mean Paul is basically saying, according to the world's standards of the time, the idea that God could be shamed by being a man who was crucified like a common criminal just threw everything in the face of what the world thought it knew about God and the nature of God and the universe and stuff. Because I think because of our cultural upbringing, we fail to appreciate how revolutionary the idea was back in these days. That not only were people claiming, these Christians were claiming that God was a man in the flesh, but even worse, they were claiming, or even more alarmingly, they were claiming that this God in the flesh was punished as a criminal and hung on a Roman cross. To the Greeks, and that's really the part And by Greeks here and Gentiles, Paul doesn't necessarily mean Greek people, although that's the context he's talking about. He just means anyone non-Jewish. But in the context of the time, you know, in the background of the world at the time, you had the Greek great gods of Olympus, you know. You had the Roman versions of those gods. You had legendary legendary stories about the might and the strength and the power of all these mighty gods, and how they were on, you know, they were on high, and they were untouchable, and they were like unmoved by humans. And you had this great glorious picture of the divine really as the norm. So Paul is sort of saying in this context, look, God sort of took your pearly white picture of what the divine, what providence is supposed to be like, and sort of threw it in your face. So that's why it says in the verse 22, for Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom. No Greek philosopher or a sophisticated, you know, Greek mind would think that like the creator of the universe not only came in the flesh but was executed as a criminal. To them it was absurd, this idea, because they would think that the incarnated God would be like a wise, like a super enlightened sage philosopher, you know, who just like had the most profound wisdom and everything. Not this dude who is like beaten and then killed on a Roman cross. It doesn't make any sense. But it also says, for Jews demand signs. And the Jews, in their own way, during that time, expected the Messiah, or, you know, the messenger, the deliverer of God, to be this like great and mighty king, and have wonderful like signs and stuff. And that's not to say that Christians didn't believe Jesus did those things, but the Jews like they wanted more. They didn't. If you just went up and said to a Jew, yeah, here's the Messiah, by the way, he's an incarnation of God, never mind that part, but here's the Messiah, yeah, he's crucified on a cross and he's killed by the Romans. I mean, this was absurd to them. And that's what Paul is really pointing out, is that to them, God sort of shows them their foolishness by being like, look, here's God who goes against all your so-called standards. And God has this funny way of like turning our preconceived notions about God on their head and just turning them upside down. And that's what it means by when it says, for God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. That even Christ, who is pitifully being executed on this cross, is still stronger of a image and of a message than some great robed sage up in a marble palace, you know. Another thing is, I think a theme that runs in this is humility. This idea that like, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, starting in verse 30, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, quote, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. I tend to think of this part as like, a lot of times the religious elites of the time, when this was all written, would sort of adopt the more or less the role of this great, of their particular theology and their particular gods, and they'd adopt the opulence of that for themselves in order that they would boast in themselves, like, oh look, I'm an apprentice of the great and mighty Jupiter, or whatever. Like, they'd use it as a sort of way to exalt themselves. But Paul's saying here that God takes the rug from underneath the feet of that egotism by making this imagery of the humble, defeated Christ on a cross nothing to boast about, but only to boast about God. So it removes that sort of glamour, is what Paul, I think, is alluding to. I'll continue. It goes into chapter 2. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. So it's more of a simplistic, not a sophistication of so many lofty words and flowery language and sophisticated ideas of philosophy and stuff. He just has a simple message of, redemption, and here's this God, and just pay homage to that, and you're all set. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God. This is really the tip of an iceberg of a much bigger idea, in that despite all the sophistication, despite all of the intricate ideas, the message here is simple faith. And the message here is simple humility, that God cannot be figured by human wisdom and brought to us by figuring, or by human wisdom. That it's something that's just recognized, or it isn't. It's something that's just recognized, absorbed, and proclaimed, or it's not. It's not some kind of, God isn't some kind of great mystery where it's all shady and shadowy and secretive, and there's mysteries about it. It's like mysticism kind of. Paul's presenting here a much more simplistic view that even children could understand it. And I'm gonna continue on to verse 6 just for the sake of how interesting it sounds. Yet among the mature we do not speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to perish. But we speak God's wisdom, secret and hidden, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. This is really mysterious, because Paul, while he's saying that there's a presentation of a simplistic faith, beneath that veneer of simplicity there's this mysterious meat and milk, meat for the knowing, milk for the novice type of thing, where it's initiatory, having simple faith in Jesus Christ as your Redeemer is enough. But Paul is saying that there are deeper mysteries when it comes to the nature of who God really is, and that this wisdom, as he puts it, sort of slipped beneath the radar of the rulers of his age, of this age. The rulers meaning the minds that sort of had the predominance in the world of Paul. The sort of philosophy and traditions of human wisdom. It slipped under that. It was able to become manifest in spite of that intellectual intensity of his world, speaking about like Greek wisdom traditions and stuff. What no eye has seen, Paul makes a reference of some kind here. He says, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. Again, Paul's sort of saying you can't figure the love of God. It's something that God prepares for people who are willing to accept it and who just have simple devotion and love to God. It's not a matter of being sophisticated or intelligent enough to have it. It's more of like a love that you either accept or you don't.